3, 2, 1.
In school, we learn about the Cold War. We learn about the space race, the embargoes, and the risk of a nuclear showdown. We learn that the Cold War was a period of global tension that was cold because the US and Soviet Union were not actually fighting. But for many countries in the global south, this war was bloody hot.
Las Fuerzas Armadas y Carabineros asumieron el gobierno.
Besides the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, there was a large number of neutral countries that were not aligned. This included almost the entire continent of South America. These countries were a battleground for the Soviet Union and the United States. And in the 1960s, the Soviets were winning.
Porque un obrero sin trabajo, no importa que sea o no sea marxista, no importa que sea o no sea cristiano, no importa que no tenga ideología política, es un hombre que tiene derecho al trabajo y debemos dárselo nosotros.
Many of these countries were swaying to the left. But in the 1970s, the continent made a sudden and dramatic turn to the right. In just a matter of a few years, all of these governments were overthrown by right-wing dictators. They hunted down any left-wing sympathizer, and they did so with unprecedented levels of efficiency and cooperation. These dictators had built far-reaching alliances, where they would kill each other's enemies in their countries. A Bolivian president fled to Argentina and was killed by Argentine agents. Uruguayan activists fled to Brazil and were kidnapped and returned. South America had never seen such international cooperation before, and it was not limited to their continent. Their attacks reached as far as Italy, the United States, and France. And all of these countries were intimately aware of what these regimes were doing. And the West responded with firm handshakes. Thousands of CIA documents are now declassified, and they show how particularly the United States was involved in working with these regimes. While these dictators killed and tortured and disappeared thousands of people, they were providing the funding, training, and weapons to further their cause. After all, they were doing the dirty work in their Cold War against the left. These declassified documents reveal a story of how South America as we know it today was shaped, and that painfully enough, most of them got away with murder. It started with the establishment of power. The masterminds behind this transition to the right established their power through 7 coups. These were often executed by their own militaries, but in almost every case the United States was involved or is suspected of involvement. Starting in Paraguay in 1954, where a rivalry within the ruling party led to the overthrow of the government. General Alfredo Stroessner took power and would become the president of Paraguay until the end of the Cold War in 1989. In 1964, the president of Brazil was João Goulart. He was outspokenly critical of a US invasion of Cuba. He wanted to impose higher taxes for multinationals based in Brazil, and he advocated more state control of the Brazilian economy. John F. Kennedy wasn't supportive of these ideas. In these declassified recordings, he says that he's giving the damn country away to the communists. Kennedy began his search for allies in Brazil, and he found them in the military. I think that one of our most important jobs is to strengthen the spine of the military, to make it clear, discreetly, that we're not necessarily hostile to any kind of military action whatsoever if it's clear that the reason for this military action is against the left. Less than 2 years later, while Johnson was in office, the military made their move. On March 31st, 1964, the government of João Goulart was overthrown, and a military junta was installed. A right-wing president was appointed, one that the US could approve of. In return for the financial support that they received for the coup, within 2 years, half of the Brazilian industry was seized by foreign companies. Brazil was under control. In Bolivia, something similar happened. A socialist military leader called Juan José Torres fought himself into power, and he was steering Bolivia towards the left. To the United States, he was radical and ultranationalist. and Henry Kissinger in this memo felt the need to put his leadership in quotation marks. The United States proposed a covert action to cope with this unfavorable political trend. They provided the opposition with military support, training, ammunition, and equipment, as well as economic support. The idea was that inaction on their part could leave the door open for an eventual extremist takeover. The support from the United States as well as that of Brazil helped the right-wing opposition under General Hugo Banzer to overthrow the government in 1971. Uruguay had a slightly different story. President Bordaberry was democratically elected, but his country was rising up. The trade unions were calling for workers to strike and to occupy the factories. 15 days into the protest, President Bordaberry decided to strike back. He ordered to capture every trade union leader. Within days, they were all killed, in jail, or in exile. Bordaberry then closed parliament and continued to rule the country with the military. All political parties from that moment onwards were illegal, and Uruguay was in a dictatorship. That same year was the coup in Chile. Salvador Allende was exactly the problem that the United States expected he would become. He had virtually no opposition to hold him in check, and the Allende government may be expected to work against US interests in the hemisphere and in the rest of the world. They caught wind that the military may attempt a coup against Allende. On September 11th, the military made their move. They bombed the presidential palace, where Allende took his own life. Augusto Pinochet became the new leader of Chile. The role of the United States is disputed, but we do have this memo between President Nixon and Kissinger. Nixon says, "We didn't, as you know. Our hand doesn't show on this one. We didn't do it, we helped them. Blank created the conditions as great as possible." Chile was now ruled by Augusto Pinochet. 2 years later, in Peru, the left-leaning president was overthrown by his prime minister. General Bermudez took power and reversed many of the leftist policies of his predecessor, putting the country on a course of right-wing capitalism through military rule. Peru was in check. The last of the 7 coups was in Argentina. On March 24, 1976, shortly after midnight, the president of Argentina was detained and a coup was set in motion. All television and radio stations were interrupted and replaced by a military march. It was announced to the Argentine people that the military had taken control. Jorge Videla, from that moment onwards, ruled Argentina. By now, in the mid-1970s, the Latin American continent was ruled by largely right-wing dictators, and they had to ensure that they remained in power, no matter the cost. On November 25, 1975, on the birthday of Augusto Pinochet, leaders of the military intelligence services of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay and Uruguay met in Santiago de Chile. They formed the basis of a long-range cooperation and they gave it codenames. Operation Condor was officially born. These agencies would jointly carry out operations against their enemies on each other's soil. This also included what the CIA called illegal operations outside Latin America against exiled terrorists. These governments sent teams to Europe under Operation Condor to liquidate top-level terrorist leaders. As reported in this CIA document, this included opposition leaders, as well as leaders of Amnesty International. Teams of security officials were sent to Europe in disguise to monitor suspicious activity. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The operation also included psychological warfare and a propaganda campaign. There was a high level of cooperation. Each country was required to maintain an open channel over the Condor network. They all assigned advisors to the other countries to identify subversives in exile. The United States was aware that these 6 countries were forming a bloc and that they intended to find and kill terrorists in their own countries and in Europe. In the same report, they recognized that the definition of subversion includes nearly anyone who opposes government policy. They were well aware of certain operations under the program that included kidnapping and torture, and other cases of political exiles that were killed under mysterious circumstances. But on the other hand, they were doing the dirty work that was beneficial to them. The United States sustained close relations with these dictators, and in some cases, they provided funding and training. For the US, in many ways, they were the perfect allies in the war against communism on the continent. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina participated in the Dirty War. The Argentine military had received training at the War School of Paris in the late 1950s. They were taught by the French military that successfully used torture as a weapon during the Algerian War. This is how they learned about the death flights, in which people are thrown out of airplanes in the open ocean, a tactic that the French had used in Algeria and was now teaching to the Argentine officers. Shortly after Jorge Videla took power and Operation Condor was established, these tactics were brought to fruition. Between 9,000 and 30,000 people were killed or disappeared in an attempt to silence social and political opposition. They were so good at executing what they had learned that 2 years into the operation, security officials from West Germany, France, and Britain met with Argentine intelligence services to discuss the establishment of a similar organization in Europe. The intention was for these agencies to coordinate in a similar fashion against subversives in Europe. A notable victim of this war was Carlos Prats, a high-ranking army official and the vice president of Chile at the time of the coup. He was assassinated by the Argentine intelligence agency. Another notable victim was Juan José Torres, the ex-president of Bolivia. He was assassinated by Argentine intelligence agents in Buenos Aires. The Brazilian ex-president João Goulart, who lost power during a coup in 1964, was allegedly killed in exile. He died in Argentina of a heart attack in his sleep, but an autopsy was never performed. Another notable case in Brazil is the kidnapping of the Uruguayans. The Brazilian military had given permission for senior officers of the Uruguayan army to secretly cross the border and to enter Porto Alegre. Their mission was to kidnap an activist couple and their 2 children, but the mission failed after an anonymous tip was sent to the press. The case received international attention and embarrassed both the governments of Brazil and Uruguay. The couple was returned to Brazil, where they were detained and tortured until democracy in Uruguay was restored in 1984. Peru was involved in planning Operation Condor, but to a lesser extent. The most notable case is that of Javier Díaz-Canseco, one of the founding members of the Socialist Party of Peru, who claims to have been kidnapped together with 12 other critics of the dictatorship. They say that they have been handed over to the Argentine military for being a leftist. Peru also assisted Argentine agents in the kidnapping and disappearance of guerrillas that were exiled in Peru. In relation to its size, Uruguay had the most political prisoners. They aggressively chased political opponents across the continent and made them disappear. They also have one of the best reported cases of CIA consultancy and training of local law enforcement. The most famous example is that of Dan Mitrione, who trained local police in the use of torture. He was stationed in Uruguay for a large part of his career, and he was ultimately killed by a left-wing guerrilla group. The US frequently trained Latin American officials, most famously at the School of the Americas, which was nicknamed the School of the Assassins. The school was founded in Panama and remained there until 1985. More than 60,000 soldiers and officers from Latin America graduated from this school. Amongst its elite graduates are a dictator from Bolivia, another dictator of Panama, another from Argentina, and many high-ranking army officials. They were taught the United States tactics for suppressing communism. They were taught about the tactics of communist revolutionaries, mistakes that other countries made, and tactics to suppress them through violence. And they were taught by some of the most elite CIA and FBI agents in the business. The United States had backed a coup by Alfredo Stroessner, and now they supported him on the ground. They provided military personnel to assist in the construction of a torture center known as La Técnica. This example is one of the most horrifying I found, and I decided not to include the details. But one notable case at La Técnica, and I will spare you the details, is the murder of the Communist Party secretary from Paraguay. Dictator Alfredo Stroessner was listening on the phone as the secretary was murdered, and he demanded that the recordings would be played to his family members and to other prisoners. Bolivia was one of the founding members of Operation Condor. Hugo Banzer held the presidency from 1971 to 1978 in a military dictatorship, and his regime aggressively pursued opponents of the government. Some 3,000 people were arrested, 200 were killed, and many more were tortured. At least 2,000 people have been detained in the basement of the Ministry of Interior, which have been dubbed the horror chambers. The alliance under Operation Condor helped Bolivia in their pursuit against subversives. The estimated number of killings that is directly linked to this operation is 72, 36 in Chile and 36 in Argentina. Lastly, in Chile. Chile was of particular interest to the United States. Let's go back a few years. In 1970, the leader of the Communist Party was trying to win the power of government fair and square for democratic elections. Something that had never been done before, but right now it seemed like he was actually going to win. And this posed a unique challenge for the White House. Assistant Secretary William D. Rogers 6 weeks before the election. After all we've said about the elections, if the first time a communist wins, the US tries to prevent the constitutional process from coming into play, we will look very bad. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, the president's view is to do the maximum possible to prevent an Allende takeover, but through Chilean sources and with a low posture. But then on election day, this telegram reached the White House. The subject, Allende wins. An emergency meeting was held between President Nixon, Kissinger, and their intelligence chiefs. Their notes say, 1 in 10 chance perhaps, but save Chile. 10 million available, more if necessary. Full-time job. Best man we have. Make the economy scream. The United States had about $1 billion invested in the country, and Chile owed them $1.5 billion. Relatively, they had very little capital at risk. But Chile meant much more than that. You already know how this story ended, with a coup and a dictator taking power, with the support of the United States being disputed. In a report that was first published in 2004 and last updated in 2011, they identified almost 30,000 victims of illegal detention and torture under Pinochet. That the government of the United States was friendly with the Chileans was no secret. One conversation that illustrates this dynamic particularly well is between Assistant Secretary William D. Rogers and Chile's foreign minister at the time of the dictatorship. They are talking about an investigation into human rights violations that the Chilean government had recently denied access. Rogers says that his view on the question of human rights is on 2 levels. One is that it's a total injustice, because nobody goes around making statements about what is going on in Kampala or in the Central African Republic. In other words, if the world doesn't care about those human rights violations, why would they care about them in Chile? He adds that he would be in great trouble when this is leaked to the papers. His other issue with helping Chile's government is that the present conditions are challenging, which is likely a reference to the investigation and the negative attention in the press at that time. But the secretary's tone is overall very friendly. He adds that anything to alleviate that situation and in a somewhat visible way would be enormously helpful. This would make it easier for the United States to support Chile at this moment. The foreign minister responds that any alleged violations are absolutely false and that he's absolutely convinced in his own conscience that they are not taking place. This amicable relationship quickly became subject to public scrutiny when the violence against civilians reached North America. A few years after Pinochet took power, he assassinated Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. Letelier was an outspoken critic of Pinochet, and he served as the Minister of Defense under Allende. The CIA reported to have convincing evidence that President Pinochet personally ordered his intelligence chief to carry out the murders, and that Pinochet decided to stonewall on the US investigation to hide his involvement. A second incident occurred in Santiago de Chile in 1986. 2 protesters were arrested and deliberately burned alive. One of them died, and he had a Canadian nationality. The other was a Chilean national, and she survived the attack. The Chilean government said that they burned themselves by accident, but the public believed otherwise. The intel from the United States confirmed that eyewitnesses had testified that army personnel was clearly involved. In the 1980s, most of these countries made the transition from military rule to civic democratic rule, starting in Peru and Bolivia. Argentina and Uruguay followed in 1983 and 1985. Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay in 1989. With this victory for democracy began a search for answers. How big were the scars that these military regimes had left behind? The first major revelation came from Paraguay. On December 22, 1992, a lawyer called Dr. Martín Almada was looking for files on a former prisoner. He went down to a police station in a suburb of Asunción, and what he discovered shocked the world. He found an archive that held 60,000 documents and almost 600,000 microfilmed pages. It weighed 3,600 kilograms. The documents described in detail how security services of various countries in South America kidnapped, tortured, and killed civilians. This was the first time that the world heard about Operation Condor and the involvement of the CIA. These revelations put pressure on the administration of Bill Clinton, who eventually decided to release thousands of previously classified documents to great anguish of the CIA. These newly elected presidents of these South American countries commissioned reports on the crimes that were committed during the dictatorships, and slowly a picture began to form of the true scale of secret operations. The archives from Paraguay listed 50,000 murders, 30,000 disappearances, and 400,000 political detentions. This started the judicial process against the military rulers, but they had years to bend the laws of their countries in order to protect themselves. Despite the transition to civilian rule, the militaries are still powerful. The military regimes often established laws giving the armed forces extraordinary powers, and they appointed civilian allies to government positions, in anticipation of the eventual transition to civilian rule. This is virtually a guarantee against accountability. In the media, this is often called impunity. The judicial process started nonetheless. Francisco Morales Bermudez of Peru lost his seat after democracy was restored in 1980. He ran for president again 5 years later and received 1% of the vote. In 2017, an Italian court sentenced him to life in prison for the disappearance of 25 Italian citizens under Operation Condor. He turned 100 in 2021 and still lives freely in Peru. Augusto Pinochet was arrested in 1998 on charges of genocide and terrorism. He was placed under house arrest as preparations were made for his trial. In 2000, he was released for medical reasons and he returned to Chile. He died in 2006 of a heart attack, without having been convicted for any of the crimes of which he was accused. Alfredo Stroessner fled to Brazil after he was ousted in a coup in 1989. He lived there for 17 years before he died in 2006. He was never convicted for the crimes of which he was accused. Juan Maria Bordaberry was arrested in 2006 and sentenced to 30 years in prison in 2010. He died 15 months later at the age of 83. In Brazil, nobody has ever been convicted of human rights violations under the 20 years of dictatorship. Amnesty laws had successfully protected both government officials and leftist guerrillas. Hugo Banzer lost his seat with the return to democracy in 1978, but managed to get democratically elected in 1997. He resigned in 2001 for health reasons and died a year later. He was never convicted for the crimes of which he was accused. Argentina concluded the trial of the juntas in 1985. The men on trial were high-ranking politicians and army officials, including Jorge Videla. He was sentenced to life in prison but was released 5 years later in 1990, when President Menem pardoned the Argentine officers. He said that he signed the decrees so we may begin to rebuild the country in peace, in liberty, and in justice. But there was a lot of critique. I don't think that peace can be achieved by granting pardons to those who have kidnapped, tortured, or committed murders. Only justice can guarantee true peace, one investigator said. The legal battle continued. In 2006, a judge revoked the pardon, saying that it was unconstitutional. This ruling led to a new trial against 600 defendants, amongst which was Jorge Videla. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2010, at the age of 84. There was an effort to start a judicial procedure against US officials. Especially the role of Henry Kissinger was well documented and often discussed in the press. But nobody in the US government has been convicted for any actions in support of these military regimes and Operation Condor.